An elderly man saved two dying bear cubs. Their gratitude will shock you. Have you ever wondered how a single act of kindness can ripple through time, creating bonds that defy the very laws of nature? This is the extraordinary story of Thomas Whitaker, a reclusive widower who lived deep in the Montana wilderness. His life was a quiet echo of solitude, until the day he found two orphaned bear cubs shivering in the snow. What happened next would change everything, and by the end, you'll question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, survival, and the power of gratitude. The forest was still, blanketed in a silence that only winter could bring. Thomas Whitaker moved through the snow, his boots crunching softly as he carried his rifle over his shoulder. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he welcomed it. It reminded him he was alive. Life as a recluse suited him, though he hadn't always lived this way. Years ago, Thomas had been a park ranger, married to a woman whose laughter could melt the harshest winter. Margaret had been his anchor, his reason for staying tethered to the world. But when cancer took her, he retreated to the mountains, seeking solace among the pines and wildlife she had loved so dearly. As he trudged through the woods that day, looking for deer tracks, a strange sound broke through the stillness. At first, he thought it might be the wind, but as he paused to listen, he realized it was something else entirely, a faint, high-pitched cry. Thomas frowned. It wasn't a sound he recognized immediately, but it carried the unmistakable weight of desperation. Curiosity tugged at him, and he veered off his usual path, following the noise. The cries grew louder, leading him deeper into the forest. Then he saw them, two bear cubs huddled together near a fallen tree. Their tiny bodies shivered violently, their fur matted with frost. Thomas's heart sank as his eyes fell on the patch of blood-streaked snow nearby. The remains of their mother lay partially buried under the fresh snowfall, a victim of poachers. His jaw tightened. It wasn't uncommon in these parts, but it never failed to ignite a deep anger within him. The cubs stumbled toward him, too weak to run. Their cries tugged at something buried deep within Thomas, a place he had long since closed off. He dropped to one knee, setting his rifle aside, and extended a gloved hand toward them. "You're in rough shape," he murmured. "Guess you've got no one else now." One of the cubs sniffed his hand tentatively before collapsing against his leg, too exhausted to stand. The other watched him with wide, frightened eyes, but it didn't resist as Thomas gently scooped them both into his arms. He knew it was a mistake. Raising wild animals was illegal, not to mention dangerous. But as he looked at their frail bodies, he knew they wouldn't survive another night in the open. The trek back to the cabin was arduous. The cubs were light, but their occasional wriggling made balancing them difficult. The snow grew deeper as he climbed the incline leading to his property, his cabin's chimney smoke finally coming into view. Once inside, Thomas wasted no time. He set the cubs down near the fireplace and covered them with an old blanket. Their wide eyes followed his every move, their fear palpable. He rummaged through his pantry, looking for something that might serve as food. Bears were omnivores, but these cubs were far too young for solid meals. He finally settled on a mix of condensed milk and honey, warming it gently over the fire. Feeding them was a challenge. The stronger cub drank eagerly, but the smaller one needed coaxing. Thomas's hands were clumsy with the makeshift bottle, but eventually, both cubs settled, their tiny bellies full for the first time in days. As they curled up together on the blanket, their breathing steady and calm, Thomas sat back on his haunches, watching them. Memories of Margaret filled the room. She would have known exactly what to do, her gentle touch and boundless compassion guiding her every move. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. He had no idea how to care for bear cubs, no plan beyond keeping them alive through the night. But as he watched them sleep, their small forms huddled together for warmth, a spark of something long dormant flickered to life inside him. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a sense of purpose. He leaned back in his chair, staring into the crackling fire. "Guess we'll figure it out together," he said softly as the forest outside grew dark. The first light of dawn seeped through the frost-covered window panes of Thomas's cabin. He stirred awake in his chair by the fireplace, his back stiff from a night of restless sleep. The cubs, however, were a different sight. Curled together under the blanket he'd given them, they looked peaceful, fragile, but alive. Thomas rose slowly, his joints protesting against the cold. As he stretched, the smaller cub opened one eye, yawning widely before nuzzling back into its sibling. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Thomas's mouth. "Morning, little ones," he muttered, his voice gravelly from disuse. The day ahead was daunting. Keeping wild animals wasn't just uncharted territory for him, it was dangerous. He wasn't sure how long the cubs would even last under his care. But letting them go wasn't an option, not yet. Thomas spent the morning preparing. His first task was to create a safe space for the cubs. The cabin itself wasn't built to accommodate wildlife, and he couldn't risk them wandering off or injuring themselves. Behind the cabin, he set to work building a small enclosure using leftover timber. The work was physically demanding, and the icy wind gnawed at his resolve. Yet, as he hammered the final nails into place, a sense of accomplishment washed over him. It wasn't much, but it would give the cubs room to explore without endangering themselves. Back inside, Thomas focused on their next meal. He boiled another batch of the milk and honey mixture, this time adding a bit of oatmeal for sustenance. Feeding them remained a messy ordeal, but he noticed the stronger cub was beginning to trust him, approaching with less hesitation. The smaller one, however, remained wary, retreating behind its sibling whenever Thomas got too close. "You'll come around," he said softly, holding the bottle out until the cub finally lapped at it, hunger overriding fear. The days began to form a routine. Each morning, Thomas fed the cubs and cleaned their enclosure. He treated the smaller cub's injured leg with care, wrapping it in clean cloth to keep the swelling down. By the end of the first week, the stronger cub had started to follow him around the cabin, its curiosity outweighing its instincts. But Thomas knew better than to let his guard down. These weren't pets, they were wild creatures. He reminded himself of this fact every time the cubs stumbled clumsily after him or nuzzled into his leg. Despite his growing attachment, the reality of his situation loomed heavy. Keeping the cubs was illegal, and word traveled fast in small mountain towns. Thomas hadn't had visitors in years, but the sight of boot tracks near his property one afternoon made his chest tighten. Poachers. The tracks were fresh, leading toward the eastern ridge. Whoever had killed the cub's mother was still nearby. That night, Thomas double-checked the locks on his cabin door and kept his rifle within arm's reach. The cubs, oblivious to the danger, slept soundly near the fireplace. As he watched them, the weight of his decision pressed heavily on him. "I don't know how long I can keep this up," he murmured. The turning point came on a bitterly cold morning when Thomas heard a truck engine rumbling up the dirt path leading to his cabin. His heart sank. Visitors were rare, and uninvited ones even more so. The truck stopped just short of his clearing, and a man stepped out. Dressed in a thick coat and wide-brimmed hat, he carried himself with an air of casual arrogance. "Morning," the man called out, his voice carrying over the wind. Thomas didn't respond immediately, his hand resting on the axe he'd been using to split wood. "Nice spot you've got here," the man continued, walking closer. "Peaceful. Good for keeping secrets?" Thomas's grip on the axe tightened. "What do you want?" The man smirked. "Oh, nothing much. Just heard some interesting stories. Folks saying you've been keeping some unusual company." Thomas felt his stomach twist. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's eyes flicked toward the cabin, where faint noises from the cubs could be heard. His smirk deepened. "You know, a man's business is his own. But some folks might not see it that way." "I think you should leave," Thomas said, his voice low and steady. The man raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just a friendly visit. For now." As the truck disappeared down the trail, Thomas exhaled slowly. The man's words had been a warning and a threat. That night, as the cubs pressed against him for warmth, Thomas whispered a promise. "I'll protect you, no matter what it takes." Thomas woke before sunrise, his breath visible in the freezing air of his cabin. Outside, the mountains seemed tranquil, but he knew better. The poacher's visit had shattered the illusion of isolation he had cultivated for years. He had to stay vigilant, for himself and for the cubs. The cubs had grown more energetic over the past week. The stronger one, whom Thomas had started calling Bramble for its tendency to climb anything in sight, was now a small ball of mischief. The weaker cub, nicknamed Willow for her quieter nature, had begun to regain strength, though her limp remained. After feeding them, Thomas bundled up and stepped outside to check the perimeter. Snow covered the ground, but fresh boot tracks near the edge of his property sent a chill down his spine. They hadn't been there yesterday. Thomas's mind raced. Someone was watching him. He had no doubt it was connected to the poachers. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder as he scanned the tree line. The forest remained still, offering no clues. Back inside, Thomas paced the cabin. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd brought this trouble upon himself. The cubs played near the fire, oblivious to the growing tension. Bramble batted at an old leather glove Thomas had left on the floor, while Willow nuzzled into the blanket, her big eyes watching him intently. "You two don't make this easy," Thomas muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. His thoughts turned to the logistics of survival. He was running low on supplies, and a trip to town was inevitable. The nearest general store was a good 2-hour drive, and leaving the cubs alone was out of the question. By midday, Thomas had devised a plan. He reinforced the enclosure behind the cabin, ensuring it was sturdy enough to keep the cubs safe. With heavy reluctance, he loaded his truck and set off, the cubs watching him leave from behind the wire fencing. The drive to town was uneventful, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every passing truck or shadow on the road made his grip on the steering wheel tighten. The small general store was quiet when he arrived. As he gathered supplies, cans of condensed milk, oatmeal, and essentials for himself, he noticed the clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Marlene, watching him closely. "Been a while since you came down the mountain," she said, ringing up his items. "Needed a few things," Thomas replied curtly. Marlene didn't push, but as he handed over his cash, she leaned in slightly. "You hear about those poachers? Been causing a stir-up near your neck of the woods." Thomas's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen anything," he lied. "Well, be careful," she said. "They're dangerous folk." Thomas nodded, grabbed his bags, and left without another word. By the time he returned to the cabin, dusk had settled over the forest. The cubs greeted him with eager squeals, pressing against the wire enclosure as he unloaded the truck. After unpacking the supplies, Thomas sat by the fire, watching as Bramble and Willow wrestled playfully. Despite the looming threat, their presence filled the cabin with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. But the peace didn't last. That night, Thomas was jolted awake by a noise outside, a sharp, metallic clink, followed by hushed voices. He grabbed his rifle and moved toward the window, his heart pounding. 2 figures were near the enclosure, their shapes barely visible in the moonlight. One carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as they examined the cubs. Thomas's blood ran cold. The poachers had found him. He stepped outside, the rifle raised. "Get off my property!" The men froze, their flashlights swinging toward him. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then one of them spoke. "You don't want trouble, old man," the taller one said, his voice low and menacing. "Leave," Thomas said firmly, his finger hovering over the trigger. The men exchanged a glance before stepping back. "This isn't over," the shorter one muttered as they disappeared into the woods. Thomas stood there for what felt like an eternity, his breath clouding in the cold night air. The forest was silent once more, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. Back inside, Thomas found the cubs trembling near the back of the enclosure. He opened the gate and let them into the cabin, their small bodies pressing against his legs for comfort. As he sat by the fire, his rifle resting across his lap, Thomas realized the fight was far from over. The poachers weren't going to give up, and the cubs' safety was now a gamble he couldn't afford to lose. Looking into the flames, he whispered to himself, "I'll keep you safe. Whatever it takes." Where are you viewing this video from? Comment here, we want to know. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thomas barely slept that night. The weight of the confrontation with the poachers hung heavy in his mind. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the wind outside sent his heart racing, his grip on the rifle tightening. The cubs, huddled together near the fireplace, seemed to sense his unease. By dawn, he had made up his mind. Staying passive wasn't an option anymore. If the poachers came back, he needed to be ready. The first order of business was fortifying the cabin and its surroundings. Thomas spent the morning setting up crude but effective defenses. He reinforced the enclosure with additional layers of wire and wood, making it nearly impenetrable. Around the perimeter of the property, he rigged warning traps, simple contraptions made from tin cans and fishing line that would rattle loudly if disturbed. The work was exhausting, but it gave him a sense of control, however fleeting. By midday, the snow had started falling again, blanketing the forest in a deceptive calm. Inside, the cubs were restless. Bramble had taken to pawing at the door, his small but growing claws scratching at the wood. Willow, more cautious, stayed close to the fire, her injured leg still hindering her movements. Thomas crouched beside them, running a hand over Bramble's thickening fur. "You're getting big," he murmured. "Won't be long before you're too much for this cabin." The thought filled him with a bittersweet ache. He knew he couldn't keep them forever. They were wild animals, destined for a life in the wilderness. But letting them go felt impossible, especially with danger lurking so close. That afternoon, Thomas set out to scout the forest. He needed to know if the poachers were still nearby. With his rifle slung over his shoulder and a heavy coat shielding him from the cold, he moved silently through the trees, his boots crunching softly against the snow. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made his skin prickle. He followed the tracks the poachers had left the previous night, careful to stay hidden behind the dense trees. After about an hour of searching, he found their camp. It was nestled in a small clearing, the remnants of a fire still smoldering. Empty cans and cigarette butts littered the ground, along with a pile of animal pelts. The sight made Thomas's stomach churn. Among the pelts was one that unmistakably belonged to a bear, its fur stained with dried blood. His hands clenched into fists. These men weren't just poachers, they were ruthless, taking whatever they could find and leaving destruction in their wake. A sudden sound, a branch snapping underfoot, snapped him out of his thoughts. He ducked behind a tree, his heart pounding. Voices reached his ears, growing louder as the poachers returned to their camp. "Told you the old man's hiding something," one of them said. "Yeah, but he's not gonna hand them over," another voice replied. "We'll have to take care of him first." Thomas's blood ran cold. They were planning to come back, to kill him if necessary. He retreated as quietly as he could, his mind racing. Back at the cabin, he double-checked his traps and barricades, ensuring everything was in place. The cubs watched him with wide eyes, sensing the urgency in his movements. By nightfall, Thomas was ready, or as ready as he could be. The rifle lay loaded by his side as he sat in his chair, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just as he was starting to believe they wouldn't come, the warning traps outside clattered loudly. Thomas sprang to his feet, his pulse thundering in his ears. Through the window, he could see the faint glow of flashlights cutting through the darkness. The poachers were here. The first man approached the enclosure, his silhouette visible against the snow. Thomas didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing through the forest. "Leave now," he shouted, his voice firm and unwavering. The men hesitated but didn't retreat. Instead, the taller one stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "We're not leaving without what's ours." "They're not yours," Thomas growled. The man laughed darkly. "You think you can protect them forever? You're just an old man." As the words left his mouth, Bramble let out a low growl from inside the cabin. The sound startled the poachers, their flashlights darting toward the door. Thomas seized the moment. He fired another shot, this one aimed just above their heads. The bullet struck a tree, splintering the bark and sending the men scrambling back. "You want to test me?" Thomas yelled. "Go ahead. But you'll regret it." The poachers hesitated, the tension thick in the air. Finally, one of them muttered a curse and gestured to the others. "Let's go." They retreated into the darkness, their flashlights disappearing into the trees. Inside the cabin, Thomas slumped against the door, his body trembling with adrenaline. The cubs ran to him, their small bodies pressing against his legs in what felt like an attempt to comfort him. For the first time in years, Thomas let out a shaky laugh, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "We did it," he whispered, looking down at them. "For now." But as he stared into their trusting eyes, he knew the battle wasn't over. The poachers would be back, and next time, they wouldn't leave so easily. The morning after the poachers retreated, Thomas woke to a new realization. He needed help. The previous night's encounter had shaken him to his core. He had managed to scare the men off, but their threats hung in the air like an ominous storm cloud. If they returned with reinforcements, his defenses would be useless. The problem was, who could he turn to? Thomas had spent years isolating himself from the world, keeping his distance from the nearby townsfolk. He didn't trust easily, and they didn't understand him. But desperate times called for desperate measures. After feeding the cubs and making sure their enclosure was secure, Thomas bundled up and climbed into his truck. Bramble whined from behind the wire, clawing at the fence as Thomas drove away. The winding road to town felt longer than usual, each mile stretching endlessly as he rehearsed what he'd say. Who would even believe his story? By the time he arrived, the small mountain town was bustling. Thomas parked near the general store, his eyes scanning the crowd. Marlene, the clerk who had warned him about the poachers, seemed like a good starting point. She was sharp and had a way of knowing more than she let on. He stepped into the store, the bell above the door jingling softly. Well, Marlene said from behind the counter. 2 visits in 1 week? What's the occasion? Thomas hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. I've got a problem, he said finally. Marlene raised an eyebrow, leaning on the counter. What kind of problem? The poachers, he said, lowering his voice. They've been on my property. Last night, they tried to break in. Her expression shifted to concern. You all right? For now. But they're not giving up. Marlene studied him for a moment before nodding. You need to talk to Caleb. Caleb? He's the ranger stationed a few miles from here. If anyone can help, it's him. He's dealt with poachers before. Thomas frowned. The idea of involving a ranger felt risky. What if Caleb decided the cubs needed to be confiscated? Marlene seemed to read his thoughts. Look, I don't know what you've got going on up there, but if these guys are dangerous, you can't handle them alone. After a moment's pause, Thomas nodded. Where can I find him? An hour later, Thomas found himself on the steps of a small ranger station tucked into the woods. The building was modest, with a green roof and a flag fluttering in the breeze. The door opened before he could knock, and a tall man in his 30s stepped out. Dressed in a ranger's uniform, Caleb had an air of quiet authority. Thomas, right? He said, extending a hand. Marlene called ahead. Thomas shook his hand, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Come on in, Caleb said, leading him inside. The ranger listened intently as Thomas explained the situation, his brow furrowing as the story unfolded. These poachers, do you recognize them? Caleb asked. No, Thomas admitted. But they know about the cubs? Caleb's eyes narrowed. Cubs? Thomas hesitated before explaining. He described how he'd found them, their condition, and the poachers' determination to claim them. When he finished, Caleb leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. You realize keeping wildlife like that is against the law, he said. I didn't have a choice, Thomas replied firmly. They would have died. Caleb nodded slowly. I get it. And from what you've told me, those poachers aren't just after the cubs. They're likely part of a larger operation. They've been active in these mountains for years, but this is the closest they've come to human territory. So what do we do? Thomas asked. We make a stand, Caleb said. Over the next few days, Caleb worked with Thomas to strengthen the cabin's defenses. He brought equipment from the ranger station, motion sensors, cameras, and even a few bear-proof barriers designed for wildlife conservation areas. Caleb's presence was a relief, but it also forced Thomas to confront his own mistrust of others. Caleb was kind but firm, and he made it clear that while he respected Thomas's choices, the cubs couldn't stay forever. They're wild animals, Caleb said one evening as they worked. You've done a good thing, but they need to be released eventually. It's the only way they'll survive. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the cubs, who were chasing each other around the cabin. The thought of letting them go felt unbearable. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said finally. The first real test of their efforts came 2 nights later. Thomas was jolted awake by the piercing sound of an alarm. He grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, Caleb close behind. The motion sensors had been triggered, and the cameras revealed 2 figures moving through the trees. It was the poachers, just as Thomas had feared. "They're back," Caleb said grimly. This time, the poachers were better prepared. They carried weapons, their intentions clear. But Thomas and Caleb weren't unprepared either. As the standoff began, Thomas felt a surge of determination. These men had underestimated him and his resolve to protect the cubs. The air was electric with tension as Thomas and Caleb took their positions behind the reinforced enclosure. The poachers moved with purpose, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Snow fell steadily, muffling the sound of their footsteps but not the intent behind them. "They're splitting up," Caleb muttered, his sharp eyes tracking the 2 figures. Thomas's grip on his rifle tightened. His breath clouded the air as he whispered, "What's the plan? Hold your ground. We scare them off if we can. If not," Caleb left the sentence unfinished, the weight of their predicament unspoken but understood. One of the poachers approached the enclosure, testing the new barriers with a crowbar. The cubs, sensing the danger, huddled near the back of the enclosure, their soft whimpers piercing the night. "Come on out, old man," the taller poacher called, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Thomas stepped into view, his rifle aimed squarely at the man. "Leave now," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The poacher smirked, lowering his crowbar slightly. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." Before Thomas could respond, the second poacher emerged from the shadows, flanking him. Caleb moved swiftly, stepping into view with his own firearm drawn. "That's enough," Caleb barked, his tone authoritative. "You're trespassing on protected land, and you're armed. Leave now, or face federal charges." The poachers exchanged glances. The presence of a ranger complicated their plans, but they weren't backing down easily. "You think a badge scares us?" the shorter one sneered. "It should," Caleb replied coldly. "This is your last warning." The taller poacher raised his weapon, a hunting rifle that gleamed in the moonlight. Thomas's heart pounded as he shifted his aim, his finger hovering over the trigger. The moment stretched unbearably, every breath a gamble. Then, without warning, the poacher fired a warning shot into the air. "Let's see how tough you are when we're not playing games," he said, stepping back. "This isn't over." The 2 men retreated into the forest, their silhouettes disappearing into the night. Thomas exhaled shakily, lowering his rifle. Caleb stayed vigilant, his eyes scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. "They'll be back," Caleb said grimly. "And next time, they won't just be testing the waters." "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Caleb turned to him, his expression resolute. "We prepare for the worst. And we call for reinforcements." The next morning, Caleb contacted his superiors, detailing the situation. By midday, 2 additional rangers arrived at the cabin, their vehicles packed with equipment. Together, they began fortifying the property further, setting up additional cameras, motion sensors, and even a small generator to ensure the alarms would stay operational. The presence of more people brought an unexpected sense of relief to Thomas, though he couldn't shake the unease that came with knowing the poachers were still out there. Inside the cabin, the cubs seemed to sense the heightened activity. Bramble, ever curious, sniffed at the boots of one of the rangers, while Willow stayed close to Thomas, her quiet demeanor a stark contrast to her brother's boldness. "They're remarkable," one of the rangers, a woman named Jenna, said as she watched the cubs. "They've been through a lot," Thomas replied, his tone softening. Jenna nodded. "And so have you, it seems." That evening, the team devised a plan. Caleb and the other rangers would remain stationed at the cabin, patrolling the area in shifts. If the poachers returned, they would be met with overwhelming force and documented evidence that could lead to their arrest. Thomas listened quietly, his thoughts drifting to the cubs. Every step he took to protect them brought him closer to the inevitable reality. They couldn't stay with him forever. As night fell, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Thomas sat by the fire, Bramble curled up at his feet while Willow dozed on his lap. Caleb joined him, his expression thoughtful. "They're strong," Caleb said, nodding toward the cubs. "Stronger than they look." "They've had to be," Thomas replied. "So have you," Caleb added. Thomas glanced at him, surprised by the comment. "I'm just doing what anyone would." "Not everyone would go this far," Caleb said. "Most people would have called for help right away, or walked away entirely." Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked into the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across his weathered face. "I owe them," he said finally. "They reminded me what it means to care about something again." The night passed without incident, but Thomas knew better than to let his guard down. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp, cold air. The forest was still, but the tension lingered. The poachers were out there, watching, waiting. Thomas turned back to the cabin, where the cubs watched him through the window. Their innocent faces filled him with a determination he hadn't felt in years. "We're ready," he whispered to himself. "Whatever it takes." The days that followed the arrival of reinforcements were tense but uneventful. The poachers, seemingly cautious after the last confrontation, didn't make an appearance. The cabin, now fully fortified, felt like a fortress, secure, but suffocating. Thomas had never been one to sit idle for long, but with Caleb and the Rangers handling the perimeter, he found himself with more time than he knew what to do with. He spent hours tending to the cubs, watching them grow stronger by the day. Bramble, in particular, seemed to be getting more curious about the world around him. The young bear was beginning to show the beginnings of his independence, his eyes sparkling with mischief as he explored every nook and cranny of the cabin. Willow, on the other hand, remained more reserved, staying close to Thomas and seeking his presence for comfort. Her injured leg had healed remarkably well, though she still favored it on occasion. One afternoon, as Thomas sat by the fire, watching the cubs play in the corner of the cabin, Caleb joined him. He had just returned from a patrol, his face etched with exhaustion. "We haven't seen anything," Caleb said, dropping into the chair opposite Thomas. "No sign of them since the last night?" Thomas nodded but didn't respond. He knew it was only a matter of time before the poachers returned. He could feel it in his bones. "They're probably regrouping," Caleb continued, rubbing his eyes. "But we're ready for them." "I hope so," Thomas muttered. Caleb studied him for a moment. "You've been quiet. What's going on in that head of yours?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his graying beard. "I'm just thinking about what comes next." "Next?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You mean after the poachers are dealt with?" Thomas hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window where the snow fell softly outside. "It's not just them. It's what happens to the cubs after all this is over." Caleb followed his gaze, his expression softening. "I know. Stuff. You've bonded with them, haven't you?" Thomas's voice caught in his throat as he nodded. "More than I ever thought I would. But they don't belong here. They belong in the wild, where they can roam free, not stuck in this cabin for the rest of their lives." There was a long pause before Caleb spoke again. "It's going to be hard to let them go." Thomas swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. "I don't know if I can. But I know it's the right thing to do. They deserve to be free." Later that night, as Thomas lay awake in his bed, his mind continued to race. The fire had long since died down, and the cabin was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the wood settling. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment when he would have to say goodbye to the cubs. The thought of releasing them back into the wild, knowing they would no longer need him, was both a relief and a crushing burden. He had cared for them when they were helpless, and now they were ready to survive on their own. But could he let them go? Could he release them into the wilderness, knowing the dangers they would face? He rolled over, his eyes landing on the sleeping cubs curled up by the fireplace. Bramble let out a soft grunt, and Willow stirred but stayed close to him. The bond they shared, forged in their darkest hours, was undeniable. They had saved each other in ways that words could never fully capture. But now their paths were diverging. The following morning, Thomas woke early. The sky was a dull gray, and a light snow was falling. He got dressed quickly, his movements mechanical as he went through the motions of his morning routine. He stepped outside, breathing in the cold air, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The world was quiet, the only sound the crunch of his boots in the snow. He walked to the edge of the forest, pausing for a moment to collect his thoughts. In the distance, the cabin stood as a silent witness to everything that had transpired. He had built it as a sanctuary, a place of safety for the cubs, but now it felt like a cage. That afternoon, Caleb and the other rangers came to a decision. It was time to set a trap for the poachers. They would stage a fake hunt, drawing the men out into the open and using their presence as bait to capture them once and for all. It was a risky move, but one they felt was necessary to end the poaching threat for good. As they prepared for the operation, Thomas found himself standing outside the cabin once again, staring at the tracks in the snow. The poachers would be caught, but what about the cubs? The evening came swiftly, and the rangers set their plan into motion. As they made their way into the woods, Thomas stayed behind, watching from the cabin. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease, a feeling that something was about to change, that the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks were leading to an inevitable conclusion. But what conclusion? The sound of distant gunshots rang through the trees, signaling the beginning of the operation. Thomas's heart raced, but he stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on the spot where he knew the cubs were waiting. They had been his family, his responsibility. But the time had come for them to stand on their own 2 feet. And when the poachers were gone, when the forest was finally safe, he would have to let them go. The days had grown colder, but nothing compared to the chill that settled in Thomas's bones as he watched the snow continue to fall outside the cabin. The days had been quiet since the poachers' last threat, but the silence only seemed to heighten his unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something dangerous that would change everything. The cubs had grown stronger in their time under his care, but Thomas could sense a growing restlessness in them. Bramble had become bolder, his curiosity and energy boundless, while Willow had become more protective of her brother and of Thomas. It was clear they were growing up fast, but with that growth came new challenges. He had started to wonder what would become of them once the poachers were dealt with. He had always known that they couldn't stay here forever, that they belonged in the wild where they could roam free. But as he looked at them now, his heart ached at the thought of releasing them back into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Thomas's heart skipped a beat, his instincts telling him something was wrong. He had made sure the cabin was secure, had checked the locks and the windows. The poachers couldn't have found them already, could they? But before he could reach for his rifle, the door swung open and Caleb stepped inside, his face grim. "They've returned," Caleb said quietly, his voice low but steady. "The poachers?" Thomas's heart sank. He had known it was only a matter of time, but hearing it aloud made it feel all the more real. "They're out there?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Caleb nodded. "They've been tracking us. They know we're here. They're getting closer." Thomas's thoughts raced as he turned to the cubs, who had been playing by the fireplace, but now stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. Bramble's small body trembled slightly, while Willow's protective instincts kicked in as she moved closer to Thomas, her gaze locked on Caleb. "I'll get the others," Caleb said. "We need to fortify this place. They'll come for you and they'll come for the cubs." The minutes that followed were a blur. Caleb had left to fetch the other rangers, and Thomas moved quickly, setting up defenses, bolting the windows shut, and ensuring the cabin was as secure as possible. His hands shook slightly as he worked, but he didn't allow himself to slow down. The urgency of the situation was clear. There was no time to waste. The cubs seemed to sense the growing tension, huddling close to Thomas as if they knew something was wrong. He knelt down beside them, his hand gently stroking Willow's fur as he whispered, "It's okay. We're going to be safe. You just have to stay quiet, all right?" But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his mind. The poachers weren't just after him, they were after the cubs. They wanted to sell them, to exploit them for profit. And Thomas knew they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. By the time Caleb returned with reinforcements, it was nearly dark. The wind had picked up, howling outside like a wild animal. The rangers moved swiftly, fortifying the cabin further, setting up traps and alarms to alert them of any intruders. Thomas stood at the window, his eyes scanning the tree line. His thoughts were torn between the immediate threat and the growing realization that something had shifted. The bond between him and the cubs was undeniable, but it wasn't just that, they had become his family. And now, he faced the possibility of losing them. "We're ready," Caleb said, stepping up beside him. "If they come, we'll be ready." But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The night passed in uneasy silence, the storm outside growing fiercer with each passing hour. Thomas sat in the dim light of the cabin, his rifle resting on his lap, his eyes never leaving the door. Bramble and Willow stayed close to him, their presence a small comfort in the midst of the fear that gripped him. Then, just before midnight, the first sign came. A soft knock at the door. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at Caleb, who was stationed near the window, watching the tree line. Caleb held up a hand, signaling that he had heard it too. Another knock, this time louder. The poachers were here. "Get ready," Caleb whispered, his voice tight with tension. "They'll be here any second." Thomas stood slowly, his rifle at the ready. He glanced at the cubs, who seemed to be holding their breath. Willow was nestled in the corner with Bramble, her eyes wide with fear. It was the first time Thomas had seen her truly scared. He couldn't blame her. He felt the same way. The knock came again, more insistent this time. It was followed by a low voice, one that Thomas recognized from the previous encounter. "You know we're coming for you, old man," the voice taunted. "We've got you surrounded. You can't hide forever." Thomas's grip tightened on the rifle. He knew this was it, the moment everything would change. "Get the cubs ready," Caleb murmured. "If we can't stop them here, we need to get them to safety." As the poachers moved closer, Thomas's mind raced. He had to protect the cubs. He had to protect them, no matter what it took. The bond they had shared over the past few weeks had grown into something far deeper than he had ever expected. They were more than just animals to him. They were his family. And family didn't leave each other behind. But the poachers weren't going to make this easy. They were closing in, and they wouldn't hesitate to take what they wanted. Thomas turned to Caleb, his eyes steely with determination. "If it comes to it, we fight. We don't let them take the cubs." Caleb nodded, his expression grim. "We'll fight. But we need to be ready for anything." The wind howled outside as the poachers' voices grew louder. They were closing in on the cabin, and Thomas could feel the tension building in his chest. The cubs huddled together, sensing the danger that loomed just outside the door. But Thomas wasn't about to let them take them. Not without a fight. The air was thick with tension as Thomas crouched near the door, the low voices of the poachers growing louder with each passing second. The storm outside was relentless, snow swirling in every direction, but inside the cabin, it was a different kind of chaos. The only sound that filled the air was the sound of Thomas's breath and the low growl from Bramble, who seemed to sense the danger that was rapidly closing in on them. Willow remained still, her small body pressed against Thomas's leg, as if trying to anchor herself in the only safety she knew. Caleb moved quietly to the corner of the room, peeking through the window as he signaled to the other rangers. They were positioned around the perimeter, ready to defend the cabin, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Thomas glanced at the cubs one more time. The once playful, curious creatures were now alert and on edge, their instincts telling them that the world outside had turned against them. He couldn't help but feel a deep pang in his chest at the thought of what they might have to face. These cubs, who had relied on him for everything, would have to fend for themselves one day. But he hadn't prepared for this. His thoughts were interrupted by Caleb's voice, barely above a whisper. "They're here." Thomas nodded grimly, his hand tightening around the rifle. He had trained for moments like this, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw, emotional weight of this particular fight. These poachers were ruthless. They had shown no mercy before, and there was no reason to believe they would show any now. The knock at the door came again. Louder, more forceful. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he motioned to Caleb to get into position. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready for the inevitable confrontation. The rangers were positioned around the cabin, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning every shadow in the snowstorm outside. The poachers were trying to play their hand, But Thomas wasn't going to let them get the upper hand again. The door rattled on its hinges. The poachers were trying to force it open. Thomas's pulse quickened, his fingers tightening on the trigger of his rifle. A voice, low and malicious, came from the other side. "You know we're coming in, don't you, old man?" the poacher called out, his voice laced with cruel amusement. "You can't hide from us forever. We'll take what's ours." The door creaked again, and this time, it was louder. There was no more hiding. Thomas glanced at Caleb, who gave a sharp nod, signaling the others to get ready. The Rangers had set up makeshift barricades around the room, and they were in position to provide cover. But the stakes were high. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about protecting the cubs. The poacher on the other side of the door was growing impatient. His voice came again, dripping with contempt. "You think you can stop us? You think you can protect those animals? You're nothing but a fool." Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he steadied his aim. "You'll never have them," he muttered under his breath, the words more of a vow than anything else. The sound of the door splintering echoed through the cabin. It wasn't going to hold much longer. The poachers were too determined, too powerful. And then it happened. A loud bang, followed by the crash of the door breaking apart, sent a shock of adrenaline through Thomas's veins. The poachers had made their move. Without hesitation, he stepped into the line of fire, his rifle raised. In the blink of an eye, the first poacher stepped into the cabin. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark camouflage, he was a formidable figure. His eyes locked onto Thomas immediately, but there was no fear in them. Just the cold, determined glare of someone who had done this too many times. The poacher opened his mouth to say something, but Thomas's shot rang out before he could. The force of the bullet sent the poacher stumbling back, his body crumpling to the floor in a heap. The room fell silent for a fraction of a second before chaos erupted. The other poachers outside immediately fired back, their shots whizzing through the cabin as the Rangers returned fire. The air was filled with the sound of gunshots and the crackle of wood splintering as bullets tore through the cabin's walls. Thomas moved quickly, firing shot after shot, covering Caleb and the other Rangers as they positioned themselves in the corners of the room. He could hear the cubs growling softly in the back corner, instinctively protective of the space they had come to call home. They were too young to understand what was happening, but Thomas didn't need them to. They would follow his lead. They had to. The fight raged on for what felt like hours. The poachers were relentless, but so were the Rangers. Thomas felt the weight of his rifle, his every move precise and calculated, but the battle was far from over. Another poacher fell, but the others regrouped and advanced. But then, amidst the chaos, something changed. A loud, desperate yell echoed through the cabin, and Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. One of the Rangers had been caught in a crossfire. He was down, bleeding heavily, unable to move. Caleb was the first to react, sprinting toward the fallen Ranger to provide cover, but in that split second of distraction, another poacher broke through the back door, aiming directly at the cubs. Thomas's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The poacher was going for the cubs. "No!" Thomas shouted, charging toward the man. The poacher smirked, his rifle raised. But before he could take the shot, Bramble, with the sudden ferocity only an animal protecting its own could have, launched himself at the poacher, knocking him to the ground with all the strength of a young bear. The poacher screamed in pain, his rifle flying out of his hand as Bramble clawed and bit at him. Willow, never one to back down when her brother was threatened, followed suit, her growls filling the room. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, staring at the cubs. He had never seen them act like this before. They were no longer the helpless creatures he had found in the woods, they were warriors. Caleb and the Rangers took advantage of the distraction. The poachers, now overwhelmed by the cubs' unexpected attack, faltered long enough for the Rangers to subdue them. One by one, the remaining poachers were taken down, their weapons neutralized. When it was over, the cabin was still. The storm outside had only intensified, but inside, there was a quiet that spoke volumes. The threat had passed. The poachers were defeated. But as Thomas stood there looking at the cubs, his heart was filled with both pride and sorrow. They had survived. But in doing so, they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer just animals. They were warriors. And now, the time had come for Thomas to make the hardest decision of all. The silence that followed the battle was almost as deafening as the gunfire had been. Thomas stood in the center of the cabin, his rifle lowered, his heart still pounding from the chaos that had just unfolded. The cubs, Bramble and Willow, were now curled up in the corner, exhausted but unscathed. Their fur was matted with sweat and blood, their young eyes wide with an intensity that spoke to a strength far beyond their years. They had fought. They had protected him, and in doing so, they had crossed into a new chapter of their lives. Thomas's gaze shifted to the fallen poachers, their bodies strewn across the cabin floor. Caleb and the other rangers were already securing them, making sure they were bound and unable to harm anyone else. The immediate threat was gone, but a deeper, more pressing realization settled over Thomas. They had been lucky, far too lucky. Bramble let out a soft growl, his eyes flicking up to meet Thomas's, as if understanding the weight of the situation. Willow, ever the protective sister, remained close to her brother, her body tense but her expression calmer now that the danger had passed. Thomas approached them slowly, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. "You two are incredible," he said softly, kneeling beside them. His voice wavered slightly, filled with awe and tenderness. But his words were tinged with sorrow, because he knew the cost of their survival. The cubs had come to mean everything to him. Over the past few weeks, they had become his family. They had grown from helpless little creatures into fierce, loyal beings, each carrying their own unique strength. But they had also grown into animals capable of violence, capable of defending what they loved at any cost. And that frightened Thomas more than he cared to admit. Caleb walked over to him, wiping the blood from his hands. His expression was weary but resolute. "We'll get these guys to the authorities. They'll be dealt with. But I need to ask you something." Thomas glanced up, his eyes meeting Caleb's. He already knew what was coming. Caleb had been with him through the worst of it, had seen the bond between Thomas and the cubs. But Caleb also understood the bigger picture, the harsh reality of the world they lived in. "You can't keep them here, Thomas," Caleb said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's not safe. The poachers may be gone, but there are others like them out there. And the longer you keep them here, the more danger you're putting them and yourself in." Thomas felt the weight of the words sink deep into his chest. He had known it was coming. He had known the day would arrive when he would have to face the reality that the cubs could not remain in his care forever. They had grown too strong, too wild, too aware of their own power. And as much as it broke his heart, he knew Caleb was right. "I know," Thomas murmured, his voice cracking. "But they've become my family. I can't just let them go." Caleb placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his grip steady, understanding. "I know it's hard, but they need to be in the wild, Thomas. It's where they belong. Not here, not with us. They need to be free." Thomas nodded slowly, but the thought of releasing them into the wilderness felt like a weight he couldn't bear. He had been their protector, their provider. He had seen them grow, seen them thrive. But the world outside wasn't kind. It was unforgiving, and the cubs had already seen a glimpse of that. They had fought for their survival in ways that no creature should ever have to. "You're right," Thomas said after a long pause, his voice barely a whisper. "I know you're right, but how do I let them go? How do I say goodbye to them?" Caleb exhaled, looking toward the cubs, who were now watching Thomas with their curious, intelligent eyes. "You don't say goodbye, Thomas. You set them free. You've done more for them than anyone else ever could. You've given them a fighting chance. That's all they need." Thomas stood up slowly, his legs heavy with the weight of the decision before him. He turned toward the cubs, his heart aching as he looked at them one last time. They had grown so much, so quickly, but the truth was he had only been a small part of their journey. It was time for them to walk their own path. The storm outside had begun to die down, and the air felt clearer now, as if the earth itself was taking a deep breath. Thomas stepped forward, kneeling in front of Willow and Bramble. He could feel the knot in his throat, the overwhelming sadness that came with the realization that he was about to let go of everything he had come to love. "You've changed my life," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible. But now it's time for you to be free. To live the life you were meant to live. The cubs looked up at him, their eyes searching his face. They didn't understand everything he was saying, but they understood the change in his tone. They understood the finality in his words. Bramble nuzzled his face against Thomas's hand, his small body trembling, while Willow gave a soft whimper, as if sensing the sadness that lingered in the air. For a moment, the bond between them felt like a tangible thing, strong, unbreakable, and yet so fragile. "You'll be okay," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always remember you." With a final, lingering touch, he stood up, his heart heavy as he walked toward the door. The cubs followed him, their eyes never leaving his, as if they, too, knew that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Thomas opened the door, stepping outside into the cold, the storm finally breaking, the sky clearing just enough to reveal the vast wilderness that lay beyond. He turned to face the cubs one last time. They stood at the threshold, unsure but trusting. "You're free now," he said softly. And with that, they disappeared into the wilderness, their small forms vanishing into the trees. As Thomas stood there, the weight of the decision settling in his chest, he knew he had done the right thing. He had given them the gift of freedom, the one thing that would allow them to truly live. But the price of that freedom had been his heart. As the last of the snowflakes drifted down, Thomas felt a quiet peace settle over him. The cubs were gone, but they had been free. And so had he. If you made it this far, comment, Wild Bear, like, share, this will help us a lot. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos.